There are few thinkers in history who felt the tremors of civilization before they struck, who saw that the structures holding humanity together were beginning to crack long before they collapsed. Friedrich Nietzsche was one of them. He lived at the crossroads of an era when faith, reason, and morality, the three pillars of Western life, were beginning to crumble. He saw clearly what so many around him refused to see, that the foundations of European belief were eroding, and soon there would be nothing left to stand on. But unlike many philosophers who retreated into despair, Nietzsche stared into that emptiness and asked a radical question. If the old gods have died, what now? Would humanity drift into meaninglessness? Or could it create something new, something beyond faith, beyond obedience, beyond guilt? Early life, from faith to doubt. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born in 1844 in the quiet Prussian village of Röcken, now part of modern-day Germany. His early life was steeped in the rhythms of devotion. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was a Lutheran pastor, a man of deep conviction. Their home was small, modest, and disciplined. Every morning began with prayer, every Sunday with sermons about salvation and divine purpose. But the child who listened so carefully to his father's words would soon be confronted with something that no theology could explain. When Nietzsche was only 5 years old, his father fell gravely ill. What began as headaches and fits turned into paralysis, madness, and finally, death, all before Nietzsche's 6th birthday. A year later, his younger brother also died. For a boy raised in the shadow of faith, these losses shattered the image of a benevolent God. The contradiction burned itself into his young mind. How could an all-loving creator allow such suffering? That early wound, the collision between belief and cruelty, would become the seed of his lifelong search for meaning beyond religion. 2. The scholar who outgrew his faith. As Nietzsche grew older, his intellect began to flourish. He attended elite schools and then studied theology at the University of Bonn, intending to follow in his father's footsteps. But university life exposed him to something he had never encountered in the church: criticism, skepticism, and scientific thought. He read the works of philosophers who questioned everything: Kant, Schopenhauer, Feuerbach. He devoured the natural sciences and the emerging ideas of evolution. Each book chipped away at the foundation of his belief until finally it collapsed entirely. By 20 years old, Nietzsche had lost his faith, not out of rebellion or arrogance, but because his mind could no longer accept what his heart could not reconcile. He transferred to the University of Leipzig to study philology, the history and analysis of language and culture. There his intellect ignited. His professors saw something extraordinary in him. By the age of 24, he was appointed professor at the University of Basel in Switzerland, the youngest in the institution's history. For most, this would be a dream fulfilled, but for Nietzsche it quickly became a cage. He found academic life stifling, obsessed with tradition, afraid of controversy, unwilling to think beyond the boundaries of approved ideas. And then came another challenge: his health. Plagued by migraines, nausea, and failing eyesight, Nietzsche began to withdraw from the classroom. After 10 years, he resigned and chose a life of solitude. Third, the wanderer and his shadow. Free from the constraints of academia, Nietzsche became a wanderer, a philosopher without a home. He spent his remaining years drifting between small towns and mountain villages across Switzerland, France, and Italy, surviving on a modest pension. His body was frail, but his mind blazed. He would rise early, walk for hours through the alpine air, and write until exhaustion overcame him. It was in these years of isolation that Nietzsche produced the works that would define him: human, all too human. Thus spoke Zarathustra, beyond good and evil, and the genealogy of morals. Each book was a lightning strike against the moral complacency of his age. 4. God is Dead, the shock wave of a century. In 1882, Nietzsche wrote the words that would echo through history. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. This was not triumph, it was terror. He wasn't celebrating atheism, he was warning of what would come after it. For centuries, Western civilization had anchored itself in the belief that morality flowed from God, that good and evil were eternal truths. But as science advanced and faith declined, that anchor was breaking loose. Nietzsche saw that when belief in God died, the entire moral order built upon it would collapse as well. Without a divine lawgiver, there could be no absolute values, only human opinions. And if everything is relative, if nothing is sacred, what stops humanity from sinking into despair, corruption, and chaos? He called this descent nihilism, the belief that life has no inherent meaning or purpose, and he feared it more than anything. Because once the old values are gone, he said, humanity will drift as though on an infinite sea without a star to steer by. The crisis of meaning. Nietzsche's prophecy wasn't abstract. He saw it unfolding even in his own lifetime. The rise of industrial capitalism had turned work into mechanical repetition. Science had reduced the soul to chemistry. Politics was becoming mass manipulation. Art, he believed, was losing its passion and courage. He wrote that the modern world was growing sick, not from poverty but from spiritual exhaustion. People no longer asked why they lived, only how to live more comfortably. In one passage, he compared Europe to a body without a heartbeat, a culture that had outlived its own beliefs. He predicted that in the coming centuries, humanity would face an epidemic of emptiness, people desperate for distraction, terrified of silence, clinging to ideologies to fill the void left by lost faith. Looking around today, it's hard not to see how accurate that prediction was. 6. The search for a new foundation. But Nietzsche was not content to diagnose the disease. He wanted to cure it. If God was dead, something else had to take his place. He rejected the idea of returning to blind belief. He also rejected nihilistic despair. Instead, he envisioned a third path, one where humans become creators of their own values. He wrote, "There are no facts, only interpretations," meaning truth, morality. All of these, he argued, are human constructions, shaped by our instincts and desires. But that doesn't make them worthless. It means we are free, terrifyingly free, to create new ones. For Nietzsche, life itself was not a problem to be solved, but a work of art to be created. 7. The artist of life. That is why Nietzsche placed such importance on art, music, and creativity. He believed that artists were the true prophets of modernity, capable of giving form to the formless, meaning to the meaningless. In art, he saw humanity's deepest impulse, not to obey or understand, but to create. But even art could be corrupted. He warned that culture could become commercialized, drained of its soul, turned into entertainment instead of enlightenment. When art becomes safe and profitable, he wrote, it no longer challenges us, it flatters us. Thus, Nietzsche turned away from society's institutions entirely. He argued that each individual must become their own artist, the sculptor of their own soul. 8. The birth of the Übermensch. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche presented his most famous concept, the Übermensch, or Overman. The Overman is not a god nor a tyrant. It is an ideal, the image of what humanity might become once it transcends its dependence on external authority. Where the old morality told people to be humble and obedient, Nietzsche's Overman says, be bold, be creative, be free. He wrote, man is something that shall be overcome. The Overman is the one who dares to overcome himself, his fears, his conditioning, his inherited guilt. He doesn't seek permission to exist. He gives meaning to existence by living fully, by turning even suffering into strength. This was Nietzsche's answer to nihilism, not escape, but transformation. 9. The will to power. Beneath all life, Nietzsche saw a single driving force, what he called the will to power. It is not the thirst for domination or conquest, but the deep instinct in every being to expand, to overcome, to grow. The will to power is the pulse of existence, the desire to shape the world rather than be shaped by it. For humans, it takes the form of creativity, curiosity, ambition, and courage. To live according to the will to power is to affirm life even in its hardship, to say yes to existence again and again, even when it hurts. Eternal recurrence, the test of affirmation. To test this philosophy, Nietzsche posed one of the most haunting thought experiments in history, the eternal recurrence. He asked, "What if a demon came to you one night and said that you must live your entire life again? Every joy, every mistake, every pain, endlessly, forever. Would you curse the demon, or would you embrace him?" To Nietzsche, this was the ultimate measure of strength. The one who can say yes to that eternal return, who would live it all again without regret, is the one who has truly affirmed life. That, he said, is the overman's spirit, not to escape suffering, but to love it as part of creation. 11. Decline and madness. But for Nietzsche himself, that ideal was almost impossible to reach. By his mid-40s, his body and mind began to collapse under years of illness and isolation. He experienced hallucinations, delusions of grandeur, moments of overwhelming emotion followed by silence. In 1889, while living in Turin, he witnessed a man whipping a horse in the street. Nietzsche rushed forward, threw his arms around the animal's neck, and burst into tears. After that day, his mind never recovered. He spent the last decade of his life in near silence, cared for by his sister, until his death in 1900. His ideas, however, did not die. They waited. 12. Legacy and misinterpretation. After Nietzsche's death, his works were edited and misused by others, most notoriously by the Nazi regime, which twisted his concept of the Overman into a justification for racial superiority, something Nietzsche himself would have despised. In truth, his philosophy was not about domination over others, but mastery over the self, freedom from herd mentality and moral slavery. Today, Nietzsche's writings are recognized as among the most profound in modern thought. He influenced psychology, existentialism, literature, and even art. Freud, Jung, Camus, Sartre, and countless others walked through doors Nietzsche had opened. 13th, Nietzsche's challenge to the modern world. Over a century later, Nietzsche's warning still echoes. We live in an age of technology, abundance, and constant connection. Yet, spiritual emptiness remains. We chase distractions, cling to ideologies, and scroll endlessly, terrified of silence just as he predicted. But Nietzsche would not tell us to despair. He would say, "This is your moment. If the old values are gone, then it is your task to create new ones." He would ask each of us, "What do you live for? What do you love deeply enough to suffer for? What beauty can you create from your struggle?" These, for Nietzsche, were the real questions of philosophy. 14. Rebirth of meaning. In the end, Nietzsche's message is not about death. It's about rebirth. Yes, God is dead, but the human spirit is not. The collapse of certainty opens the space for creativity. The loss of external purpose reveals the power of inner freedom. Life, Nietzsche tells us, has no meaning given to it, but it has meaning we can make. To live as an artist of existence, to create your own values, to embrace your suffering, to love your fate. That is what it means to overcome nihilism. When Nietzsche wrote that we must become gods ourselves, he did not mean omnipotence. He meant responsibility, the courage to bear the weight of creation. 15. Closing reflection. Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. That why is not handed down from heaven. It must be forged in the furnace of the soul." The question he leaves us with is timeless. Will we allow the death of old gods to make us smaller, or will we use it as the spark to create something greater? Because for Nietzsche, the greatest act of faith was not belief in another world. It was the decision to say yes to this one.